All right. Well, I'd love to welcome you here to the latest edition of the Global Health Politics Workshop here at the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future at Boston University. We are very pleased today to have Alexandre Sasha White here. He is not only an assistant professor of the history of medicine and sociology at Johns Hopkins University, but he is also author of an incredible new book. If you haven't gotten it, I encourage you to go out and buy it right now. He can tell you a coupon code, I'm sure, through Johns Hopkins or through Stanford University Press, get you a nice discount. But it is Epidemic Orientalism, Race, Capital, and the Governance of Infectious Disease. Again, published by Stanford University Press. It's an incredible book. If you haven't read it, please go do it now. And I'm also pleased to have Sasha here because he is an alumni of the BU Sociology program and one of the real engines behind the growing sociology of global health. So please help me welcome Sasha White, and he'll be talking about his book today.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's really it's lovely to be back in Boston, and a lot of the research that I did for this book was done in this very building as a fellow of the Pardee Center. So it's a nice homecoming. What I want to talk about today is really I'll be giving a presentation on the final chapter of the book. It's also probably the most policy dense in terms of the complexity of it. So it's really nice to be in a community of folks who really think deeply about the politics of global health and the practices around it. And the chapter is titled Necrophyte and Speculative Epidemic Response and the World Bank. Before we go into that, though, I want to give you a little brief outline of the book. This is the cover I was mentioning. But the book title, Epidemic Orientalism, Race, Capital, and the Governance of Infectious Disease. The history of international infectious disease control and regulation has largely been one in which powerful imperial or European and North American nations have held themselves up as the exemplars of sanitation, health, and hygiene at risk from a constructed, quote-unquote, backwards rest of the world. But for what ends? What historically have been the rationales and justifications for international cooperation over infectious disease control? How do epidemics become the object of regulation and international control? And how do these questions affect which diseases become the focus of international response and which ones do not? And this book takes as its focus the history of the international sanitary conventions of the past, the international health regulations of today, and the recent global health strategies that have emerged since the West African Ebola virus disease epidemic, the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility of the World Bank, which I'll be talking about in particular today. And in examining the history of these regulations and strategies, I argue that we can see the interplay between scientific knowledge and various forms of political and economic power. And these regulations reflect not merely banal forms of trade and travel protections from infectious disease, but rather also a landscape onto which systems of relations between states, empires, and peoples are mapped, and global economic and political orders are rationalized into infectious disease controls. Moments of reform and regulatory creation and the drafters of these regulations themselves expose debates and struggles over how diseases, those carrying them, and those at risk from disease should be managed globally. The final forms of these regulations take, I argue, and have taken presuppose particular dynamics of power, forms of sovereignty, and political and economic rationalities that augment and orient their ultimate structure. So these regulations are, in fact, landscapes onto which the drafters of these documents sought to map global relations of power and order of the world. And we can learn a great deal from the format of these regulations and how their framers conceive of the epidemic spread, what sorts of regulations are and can be imposed to prevent the spread of disease, and what species of power are mobilized onto which spaces and whose bodies to prevent the spread. So beyond the epidemiology and scientific understandings of disease, I've really become fascinated by the ways that successive generations of authors of infectious disease regulations have justified the need for infectious disease controls, in part by producing or reproducing a vision of the Western world apart from a diseased rest of the world. So in the book, I explore how the first international regulations of infectious disease control emerged in the mid-19th century, and how concerns of Europe's largest empires structured the perceptions of disease threats. So that would be in this chapter here. Later, I examined how these regulations transitioned into their present-day instantiations under the authority of the World Health Organization prior to the establishment of the WHO in the 1920s and 30s. In the chapter, the WHO's Epidemic Authority, which I look at really the 1920s and 30s until the formulation of the International Health Regulations in 1969. My next chapter, The Battle to Police Disease, begins with the reform of the International Health Regulation in the regulations of the 1990s and explores how the WHO managed the demands of global disease control against their own priorities and shaped the present-day international health regulations that determine health responses for the moment. We know that there are new pandemic regulations and the IHR being reformed currently. But by interviewing senior officials of the WHO in the chapter Policing the Modern Plagues, and this is work that I did at the Party Center in particular, I show how disease risk is understood and how responses are governed today and grapple with the challenges of the present. And then in the final chapter, this one, I explored new systems of infectious disease management rooted in the perceived failings of the international health regulations. And that's the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility operated by the World Bank. So the argument of the work is that in order to understand how global disease priorities are set, it's not sufficient to examine the biological and epidemiological conditions of epidemics. In addition, to understand first and foremost how disease threat is considered and has been over time, how it's been perceived and acted upon, we must locate epidemic threat within the landscapes of meaning in which they're situated. Epidemics have historically been constituted as dynamic and complex forces representing a biological threat to life, but also to trade, to travel, and economic enterprise. So to read and understand an epidemic emergency through any single register is to flatten their manifold significance to a variety of different aspects of social life. So to understand the complexity of epidemics, the responses to them and their role both in history and in the present, we must locate them, the actors in their institutions, and political forces organizing responses to them within these wider landscapes of meaning. And these invariably invoke questions of political economy, race and racism, colonial power structures, and the durability of these themes. So in the book, I propose the concept of epidemic Orientalism to describe that particularly durable landscape of meaning, the discourse and viewpoint rooted in Europe's first engagements with the rest of the world as colonizer, through which Europe came to recognize itself in relation to its colonies and the disease threats they posed. Epidemic Orientalism, therefore, describes the undergirding logics that motivated, and I argue have persisted in certain forms since the International Sanitary Conferences of the 19th century, and to which all actors in this work, really from chapter 2 onward, seem to respond. And Epidemic Orientalism takes as root the ontological separation between colonized and colonizer, which obliterates any subjectivity of the colonized beyond their relationship to the colonizing force. So in the book, my theory of epidemic Orientalism, while drawing hugely on the work of Edward Said, departs insofar as I resituate my theoretical formulation within the landscape of disease control in the 19th century. So in explaining epidemic Orientalism as a theory, I break it down into kind of three particular elements. The present day and historical systems of infectious disease control, the logics through which of which we continue to prioritize infectious threats, very much from a geographically grounded position in northern and western hemispheres, are rooted in what I would argue is a persistent and adaptive engagement with how Europe and the West has more colloquially have historically constructed race, wielded racism and xenophobia from the first colonial moments of encounter through the decline of empires. And I argue that there are three major elements of this: the geographic representation of the world through relations of disease threat to the West, the interpolation of innate difference and inferiority signified by disease, especially the diseases that come to be the focus of the international sanitary conventions and international health regulations. And then also the production of a teleological vision of disease control that elevates the West above all others. And this is really the kind of, stepped approach suggesting that at all times, the rest of the world needs to raise to a level of sanitation, of hygiene, of public health controls that meet the already existing structures that would exist in Europe and North America. And I would argue, just as a note, that the ongoing pandemic of COVID-19, I think, has shattered this particular myth in numerous ways, and it'll be really important to think about how we in the space of global health navigate that. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually this chapter that focuses on this other concept in particular called necrofinance, and this is somewhat the outline of the talk today. So let's jump right in. Pricing pandemics, necrofinance, and the World Bank. So in this chapter, I also put forward this concept called necrofinance. Achille Mbembe first articulated the concept of necropolitics to define how the departure of contemporary forms of subjugation differ from those demonstrated by Foucauldian notions of biopolitics. And Mbembe deploys necropolitics and necropower to account for the various ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of maximum destruction of persons and the creation of death worlds, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of the living dead. And if biopower is ostensibly, under Foucault, is a concept, is a theory and framework to understand who lives and which populations are allowed to die, and if necropolitics tells us why some lives are disposable to the point of mobilization to killing, epidemic Orientalism, I would argue, facilitates an understanding for how the constitution of subjects for the purposes of surveillance and sovereign control under particular visions of disease threat is conceived. Then necrofinance, as I put forward here, is a process that defines how the transmutation of people into financial subjects of speculation allow for their beings to be of value for others in life or in death. Or in a Hegelian sense, somewhat, how people are financialized into beings for others. So necrofinance allows for financial value to still be earned in the disposability of human life. And this, as I'll show, has certain valences to particular forms of global health response. So with that, let's jump into thinking about this structure in particular, the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility under the World Bank. Has anyone heard of this? Do you remember that? Yeah.
Yeah. Can we put it into picture?
Yeah. So this, this chapter focused on this kind of lesser known financing facility that became that became rather prominent in discourse in the late 2010s, and then ultimately
It's the same thing as pandemic bonds?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So on May 21st, 2016, the World Bank announced the development of the first ever pandemic emergency financing facility to prevent the worst humanitarian and economic effects of epidemic emergencies. And what this structure was essentially a bond swap. Investors purchased bonds from the World Bank Treasury for a period of 3 years, and the funds raised from the bond sales serve as liquid funds of the World Bank and used to support ongoing epidemic responses in the event that certain criteria are met. And in exchange for taking on this risk, investors would receive regular payments. Hello. And the PEF is a twofold structure. It's a cash window that can pay up to $50 million, or it was, I should say. It was a cash window that could pay up to $50 million to support early response to escalating epidemic crises, and a much larger insurance window, which provides up to $425 million to afflicted countries' aid agencies and the NGOs to facilitate support. So this novel funding strategy was designed, first and foremost, to limit the deadly delays and false promises of country pledges to support epidemic response and provide swift funding within a matter of days. And this is ultimately how it works. So, and I'm going to go into the nature of the bond swap structure in case that's, it's remarkably complicated, but we'll hopefully dive into the details of that. But ostensibly, a swap is a situation where where you enter into an agreement where, in the event of one thing, one party pays out; in the event of another, or the lack of an event, the other party receives funds and profits. So the structure by which the bond swap was meant to work in the event of an epidemic is such. Ostensibly, in the event of a high death rate plus international spread, the bonds would trigger in a particular way that would pay out funds to nations and aid agencies responding to an epidemic. And investors purchase bonds from the World Bank Treasury for a period of 3 years. In the event of no epidemic or few deaths and little spread, ultimately those investors would be compensated, and the funds would be distributed to private investors in the form of premia and payments from these bonds. So I argue, and I want to benchmark this because we'll come back to it, but in the formulation of the PEF, we have an expression of a particular form of financial power, being necrofinance, the capacity to speculate upon the lives and deaths of others in order to dictate in no small part who may live and who may die. Necrofinance is a speculative logic through which, there's my cursor, through which economic value is conferred in life and loss in death, abstracted from the lived experiences of those who perish. So central to necrofinancial systems is a reconstitution of human life into quantifiable metrics for the purposes of speculation. Where necropolitics examines the production of a necropolitical order of things through the question of sovereignty, I want to expand the concept of commodity fetishism in some ways to explore how the PEF produces novel subjects of financial speculation. So where did this structure come from? And it sounds like many of you are familiar with this, where most of the time when I present this, no one's heard of this before. So I'm really excited to chat about this. The global response to the West African Ebola virus disease epidemic of 2014 to 2016 was roundly criticized by global health actors and the media alike. Much of the blame was levied upon the World Health Organization for their hesitation to declare, among other things, a public health emergency of international concern, and their incapacity to respond to the epidemic with fully funded responses. However, this funding shortfall cannot be fully blamed on the WHO's agencies or secretariat. In April of 2014, a month after the epidemic was first reported, the WHO requested $4.8 million from international governments and aid agencies, and by November, that call would rise to $1.5 billion and $4 billion by January of 2015. However, the report of the Ebola Interim Assessment Panel, drafted by a group of independent experts, determined that the WHO was financially hobbled from the outset. Not a financial hobbit. Financially hobbled. Yeah. That concept I'll use for the next book. But was financially hobbled from the outset and continues to lack the capacity to effectively respond to health emergencies. And the interim panel found that less than 25% of the WHO's budget derives from required assessed contributions from member states of the World Health Assembly, and the rest had to be made up through voluntary donations, making it ultimately a weak entity to functionally respond to an epidemic emergency. So in around the same time, and ultimately in response to this, the head of the World Bank suggested that it was time for a new, ostensibly financial market strategy to respond to epidemic threat. And in 2015, Jim Kim stated, "The world has an IMF to coordinate and work with central banks and ministries to respond to financial crises. When it comes to health emergencies, however, our institutional toolbox is empty. There's no such center of knowledge and skill for response and coordination. The bank will be aggressive and creative and apply large-scale solutions to help states manage, prepare for, recover from, and conquer these risks so they can grow and flourish." So while the Ebola Interim Assessment Panel called for greater funding for the WHO to tackle epidemic emergencies and for the organization to have greater authority in this regard overall, the support for the world for a formal epidemic response system from the World Bank was gaining support amongst the international community. At the 2015 G7 conference, our annual meeting at Schloss Emlau, my German is horrendous, the ongoing Ebola epidemic in West Africa was a key topic. And this issue was roundly endorsed, it was roundly endorsed that the development of a pandemic emergency facility under the World Bank be developed. So what you see here, and we're going to fill out this timeline in a little bit. Ultimately, in May of 2016, we see the announcement of the development of the first set of pandemic bonds, and those are ultimately sold a little over a year later. However, and this will be the crux of the presentation today, from 2018 to 2020, where a pandemic emergency financing facility was structured explicitly with thinking around an Ebola outbreak in West Africa, we see that it fundamentally fails to pay out for the second largest Ebola epidemic in history in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this chapter seeks to address why. So though the PEF emerged out of the needs of an Ebola response, as I said, when faced with the Democratic Republic of Congo epidemic of Ebola, the largest set of funds, the potential $425 million, contributed nothing to the effort to control the spread of the disease. And though the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern in July of 2019, as of that September, the World Bank contributed $50 million from the PEF cash window and an additional $100 million from the World Bank's International Development Association, but nothing from the pandemic swap insurance bond window that it created for these purposes. It was only during 2020, during the pandemic of COVID-19, that the bulk of the PEF's funds were dispersed, contributing $195.84 million to COVID interventions in April of 2020, 3 months after the start of the global pandemic. And at the same time, investors in these bonds had received almost $100 million in returns. So ultimately, the lifespan of the PEF was short. In February of, or ultimately, there were plans for a second round of the PEF to raise more funds for further bonds, but given the wide media and global health outcry against the PEF itself, in July of 2020, the World Bank scrapped plans for the second PEF, or PEF 2.0. So how did the largest funded epidemic response facility in the world, designed in the shadow of one Ebola epidemic, fail to pay out in another? Well, when the World Bank launched their pandemic emergency financing facility, they ushered in a new modality, I would argue, for apprehending disease risk. For the first time, the risk of disease could be appraised in explicitly financial terms. The World Bank created a market for speculating on the probability of pandemic events. As such, the speculation on epidemic risk became infused and incorporated into all four corners of the global economy. And the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility insurance window, as it's formally called, operates through a mechanism that the World Bank colloquially termed a pandemic bond. And a pandemic bond is a mutation of a catastrophe bond. And here's where we can really get into the weeds. A catastrophe bond is a financial product with an interesting history. Fundamentally, it's a financial instrument to protect insurance companies and reinsurance companies, the companies that insure insurance companies, from the risk of default in the event of an acute major catastrophe. So when an insurance company, namely insurance companies that insure property, have historically purchased insurance for the company itself, they do so to offset the risk of a massive default or of insolvency from the possibility of having such a high number of costly claims that they can't pay out for all of them with existing funds. And while traditionally insurance companies derive their claims or derive funds for their claims from the collection of premiums, it's possible that a claim or multiple claims could be too large that they could possibly cover it. So for this reason, an insurance company will purchase insurance to offset the risk and provide additional funds to cover their losses. But what happens in the event that a loss is so great that even the reinsurance or the insurance on the insurance company can't cover it? And we saw this really firstly in the United States with Hurricane Andrew in the early 1990s. The Category 5 storm would ultimately produce insurance claims, especially on Miami's South Beach, totaling $15.5 billion in 1992 prices, which were almost $10 billion more than what was suggested would be the required payout in compensation. So this human and property catastrophe led to numerous insurer and reinsurer insolvencies, and the aftermath produced this structure known as a catastrophe bond. So this rather intense-looking structure is actually a catastrophe bond. And a catastrophe bond operates, in effect, as a hedge against loss, an insurance for reinsurers against high payouts from catastrophic claims. And it's an insurance swap. A bond is essentially an instrument by which a company or a nation can sell debt in exchange for immediate funds. And the issuer of a bond, the insurance or reinsurance company here, essentially is a borrower who owes the holder of the bond, the creditor, the price of the bond, the principal, plus interest in the form of regularly paid coupon until the maturity date. So let's say that's 3 years. So basically, what this figure demonstrates is the general model of a catastrophe bond relationship. A special purpose entity here, or a subsidiary, is created by the sponsor of the bond to pool debt separately from the parent company so that investors can be assured that the company is not taking any money from this to run the daily business. And when the sponsor wishes to sell its insurance risk, the vehicle issues a catastrophe bond, which is purchased by an investor at a certain face value, which is the principal. And over the course of the lifetime of this bond, it pays out regularly to the investor. Now, in the event of a certain set of conditions being met, or certain sets of catastrophes, the principal of the bond that's already been paid in would then go to the insurance company that sponsored the bond for the purposes of covering the risk. Now, what a catastrophe bond achieves is this transference of insurance risk out of the hands and accounts of a reinsurance company or insurance company to capital markets, which is to say that, if I'm an insurance company that insures half of South Beach, or insures the property along the Charles, and there's a catastrophic flood or a hurricane, the risk of paying out an extra $1 billion in damages will be very damaging to me. But when that amount is kind of diffused throughout the global financial markets, that's not very much money at all. So the argument is that while the losses are far greater than the financial capacity of insurance, they're not actually that great for the financial markets itself. But in exchange for really the catastrophic risk of losing all of the money that you've invested in, or you losing all the principal that you put into these bonds in the first place, if you're the investor, investors normally receive a higher than usual interest rate payment from these bonds. But interestingly, these have become very popular risk mitigation strategies for investors, because natural disasters of these sorts are wholly uncorrelated with financial market crises. So you could have, although it's an interesting question of how long that'll be the case, but generally, a hurricane is not correlated with a sovereign debt crisis or prior to a sovereign debt crisis. It might trigger a sovereign debt crisis, but you're not going to see a financial crisis that is linked necessarily to climate change or hurricanes and other things. So they're a way of mitigating the risk of financial crisis through investment in these other structures. And as a result, they've been very popular with mutual and pension funds as a risk abatement measure. The outstanding market as of 2019 for catastrophe bonds sat at $39.3 billion as of the second quarter of 2019. And the World Bank is the largest sponsor of sovereign debt catastrophe bonds, as said here. As of 2019, ultimately the World Bank was in a good position to be structuring these sorts of entities. the World Bank roughly facilitated, through the period of the PEF, roughly $4 billion of catastrophe bond transactions. So this is the catastrophe bond as we've now come to understand it. This is the structure of the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility. So it's more complicated, but it's pretty much the same thing. The structure of the PEF is similar to a standard catastrophe bond. However, it differs in some important ways. The PEF is more complex and also has both a catastrophe and a cash window and insurance window. So what's important to understand about the PEF itself was that the money for these bonds was provided primarily by Germany and Japan in the form of public funds that was distributed to for these bonds to take place. And they were split into a cash window, which could be triggered for any event anywhere, hypothetically, but would total only $50 to $100 million for emergencies, and these could be distributed in the form of aid-based coverage to international development association countries, UN, NGOs, etc. And then the insurance window, the much larger insurance and reinsurance window, which operated ostensibly as a traditional catastrophe bond, which would pay out to, in terms of regular premia, to via the World Bank Treasury to insurance companies and private investors in exchange for holding the risk of these bonds for 3 years. So, what's important to note from this is that the funds for this came from public sources and national sources, which actively distributed premia to private investors and reinsurance companies in exchange for holding the risk of these bonds. Now, when the World Bank set out to develop the PEF, they did it with parties that were well-versed in how to bring this form of risk to market, in particular Swiss Re and Munich Re, two of the largest insurance firms in the world. And they underwrote the bonds and served as the book runner, coordinating the issuance of these bonds. And Swiss Re had developed mortality catastrophe bonds in the past, which, similar to the PEF, are designed to offset the risk of massive loss of life, and in this case, to collateralize life insurance risk. So, if an insurance, in the event of a nuclear attack or something, the cost of covering life insurance for an entire city would be one of those sorts of conditions. And Swiss Re had previously developed two similar bonds as well for these structures. However, for the PEF, the World Bank needed to develop a set of parameters to assess the scale of an epidemic and the conditions under which a pandemic catastrophe bond might occur. And for this, they turned to Air Worldwide, which is also, we could point to another building over there theoretically, because Air Worldwide is based in Boston somewhere, a catastrophic risk modeling firm, which provides consultation services on the financial and economic risks associated with cataclysm. And central to their operations has been the quantification of pandemic risk based on a variety of deterministic and stochastic models. And Air Worldwide was brought in to model the outbreaks and establish parameters for triggering the PEF bond. And what Air Worldwide produced was a probabilistic simulation model known as the AIR or AIR pandemic model that generates potential infectious disease outbreak events in accordance with their estimated relative probability of occurrence. For the PEF, Air Worldwide captured the potential loss of life and financial risks associated with major global outbreaks of influenza, coronaviruses, filoviruses, cholera, Rift Valley fever, Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, bubonic plague, Lassa fever, and meningitis. And the Air Worldwide model is very complex, drawing on numerous sources, both historical and contemporary, as well as passenger travel data, migratory bird data, and land use data to simulate 500,000 years and over 1 million pandemic events. And from this catalog of simulated epidemics, Swiss Re and Munich Re's experience from underwriting catastrophe bonds, and the World Bank's role as a market maker, the four institutions, in conjunction with the World Health Organization, created the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility and produced two novel bond offerings. The Class A note, which is also the Class A floating rate catastrophe linked capital at risk note, or what we could call kind of the influenza bond, and the Class B floating rate catastrophe-linked capital at risk note, the Class B bond. Each of these bonds were issued separately with a different total amount. Influenza, the bonds that really protected catastrophic risk of influenza has a total amount of $225 million, and each bond was issued in minimum denominations of $250,000. And then the bond that would ultimately pay out, or the bonds would ultimately pay out for COVID, for basically everything else, coronaviruses, filoviruses, had an aggregate nominal amount of $95 million and could be purchased in minimum denominations of $250,000. And where we get into the, I argue the necrofinance of this is really in the space of the activation criteria of these bonds. And the triggering mechanism is complex. So as we said, the bonds are separated into two classes and they reflect two different categories of risk. And a number of events must occur to trigger these bonds. A potential trigger for the Class A note for influenza is as follows. An event would have to be designated by the WHO, which acts as the reporting source. And an event is any case of the covered disease as reported by the WHO. And then when an eligible event occurs, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as part of the World Bank, would provide a written notice to AIR or AIR Worldwide to assess whether the event has exceeded the parameters necessary to trigger the bond swap. And for the Class A notes, the triggers for the bond swap are the following. These are the criteria of that, namely that it has to be a novel influenza A virus, that it's spreading, and that it's sustaining transmission has a particular rate of growth. And once these criteria are met, 100% of the total $275 million will be dispersed to the regions and nations affected. Plus an additional $50 million in reinsurance swaps would also be released as well. It's more complicated for the Class B notes. Note the different amounts that could possibly be dispersed for different diseases. But the criteria are more specific, that firstly, 12 weeks had to transpire from the beginning of the event, or beginning of the epidemic, to the date of fund release. The epidemic or the outbreak has to explicitly be in more than one country, with each nation having greater than or equal to 20 confirmed deaths. The growth rate needs to be greater than 0 to ensure the outbreak is growing at a specific statistical confidence level. And this, in particular, the total confirmed death amount needs to be greater than or equal to 250. And the rolling total case amount needs to be greater or equal to 250 as well. And what you see here is really the speculating on the deaths of others in particular ways. Ultimately, what this table shows is the 3 tranches through which money would be dispersed in the Class B, in the Class B bonds for a filovirus. So what you'll see here is that at 250 deaths, basically more money the money dispersed depends on number of deaths and where those deaths are occurring. Essentially, at 250 deaths at a regional outbreak affecting 2 to 7 countries, 30% of the bonds would be released, or the funds of the bonds would be released. But a global outbreak affecting 8 or more countries at the same death rate, or at the same number of total deaths, that would be increased to 35%. At 750 deaths, once again, we see a variation. And then at 2,500 deaths or more, 100% of the bonds funds would be released regardless of the global or regional scale of epidemic. And when these bonds were listed on and then purchased via the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, they created the first market for epidemic risk, eventually just potentially diffusing some or all of the financial costs for epidemic response to capital markets. And the capital markets were overwhelmingly receptive. In order to reflect the risk of holding one of these bonds, and for bondholders to receive the maximum returns on the risk of holding these bonds, the the total premia provided on an annual return for pandemic notes was 6.5%. And for the Class B notes, it was 11.1%. And these returns were an average much higher than most traditional catastrophe bonds. Sorry, most traditional bonds, certainly, and then actually many catastrophe bonds as well. And as a result, the appetite for these bonds on the market was significant, and the bond issue was oversubscribed by 20%. Sorry, by 200%, meaning that twice the number of bonds were requested as were actually available. And the market for these bonds here largely lay with dedicated bond investors for the Class A notes, but the Class B notes were purchased significantly by pension funds. And for both the Class A and Class B notes, most of these bonds were purchased in Europe and the United States. So as we reach towards the conclusion, these bonds did not pay out for the Democratic Republic of Congo, suffering at the time the second largest Ebola epidemic, Ebola virus disease epidemic in history. The epidemic, though it existed within one country the size of Western Europe, did not cross a national border, and with such did not trigger an activation event under the stipulations of the bonds. It was only after the mandated 12 weeks had passed from the start of the COVID-19 pandemic that the PEF finally paid out $195.84 million from its Class B notes. And by this point, this fund was smaller than the disbursements that had already been released around the world in response to COVID, and made, to some extent, little dent. And what I argue is that in the pandemic emergency financing facility, we see how the transformation in how epidemic threat is quantified, how those suffering are constituted and realized in the responses to epidemics. Prior to the PEF, and explicitly under the logics of the international health regulations, the designation of a public health emergency of international concern was a gesture of symbolic power that an event will require the global community to act, and act in certain ways. In the aid world, it was partly the equivalent of a call to arms. However, the glaring weaknesses of the West African Ebola virus disease response exposed the limits of the WHO and the reliance on global charity. Rather than devoting significant funds to health systems development or holistic strategies of epidemic prevention, the World Bank sought to find a solution in the domain of finance and capital market speculation. And in doing so, they produced a novel form of global finance, one for which the lives of populations can be abstracted into financial value and risk read through epidemic risk. So, what I argue in the chapter is that what we see actually is, to some extent, the transformation of people and their health risks into through capital logics into beings whose lives and deaths can be speculated on for the purposes of either broader investor profit or aid in the event that in the event that we are able to bear witness to a certain number of people dying in a certain number of places as such to trigger this. And it's important to note, as we finish, in particular, the geographies that are implicitly a part of this conceptualization. The ways in which people suffering from epidemics are rendered as objects to be speculated upon for financial value is not uniform in its gaze. Only two European countries are represented represented as IDA borrower nations, and only IDA borrower nations were the ones who could receive the PEF, Kosovo and Moldova. And the overwhelming majority lie in Africa and East Asia and the Caribbean, and argue that the construction of non-European bodies as those who can be speculated upon for these purposes carries with it broader legacies of the histories of epidemic Orientalism that I talk about in the rest of the book. So ultimately, what I'm doing in the next project is actually thinking really more about this concept of microfinance, its roots, especially in insurance and the emergence of insurance in the transatlantic slave trade, and its connections to wider questions about health, logics of epidemic disease risk, and the construction of humans as financial objects of speculation.